Hello, everyone. Mr. Bayoumi, and I see that Professor Doyle has left the webinar. I'm guessing he's having some technical difficulties, and I was told by Professor Gökhan that he will be joining us shortly.
No problem.
Okay.
So where are you based, Karen?
I am currently based at the center, which is located in Konya.
Konya?
Yes, the central Anatolian city of Konya.
Okay.
And yourself, sir?
I'm located in London now. I'm based in London. I'm originally Egyptian,
Mm-hmm.
but I've been here for like 4 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the center is based in central Turkey.
That would be correct, yes.
How old is the center?
About a year now.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
Yeah. And the university itself, how old is it?
Approximately 10 years, I'm guessing.
10 years.
Yes.
Nice. And yourself, are you Turkish yourself, or are you?
I am Turkish.
Okay.
And 28 years old, and I've recently completed my dissertation in Jordan, actually.
Oh, about Jordan.
Yes, on master's level.
Oh, nice. Which subject?
International relations.
Nice.
Please allow me for a moment.
Take your time.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Doyle?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can. I'm hoping to get onto a different computer in a second so I get a better background, but I can now hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's good news. Seeing that you have joined us as well, I see no reason not to start.
Yeah.
And I wish to welcome everyone today on this nice occasion provided by the Center for Global and Area Studies. And I wish you welcome. And our subject is the new Cold War in the Middle East. When I first read the Arab Cold War by Kerr, actually, it was not long ago. It was approximately two years ago, and it occurred to me that the situation back then is quite reminiscent of what we are experiencing in the Middle East. But things have changed since the times of Jamal Abdel Nasser and Hafez al-Assad and the others. Now we have another Cold War, which is not Arab in nature, but we could call it Middle Eastern, seeing that non-Arab parties such as Turkey and Iran are joined. And after this soft opening, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ala Bayoumi, Egyptian journalist based in London. He writes regularly on Middle Eastern affairs, and please illuminate us, Mr. Bayoumi.
First, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I believe it is a timely and important topic. If we look at what's happening in Libya now, you can see how the Middle East actually for the last, let's say, 15 years has been an area for events, conflicts, 5-6 civil wars going on at the same time. And also, even when we look at the international order, or the international community, the US is withdrawing, China is rising. So I think it's such a good topic to discuss, and I hope I can help with shedding some lights on some of the important issues when it comes to the Middle East, like, the global competition over the Middle East, what's happening in the Middle East. I think I just want to start with a small fact, which is there is no country in this whole world that is self-independent, that's not dependent on anyone. All countries depend on each other to some level, even like, they depend on each other for energy, for exports, imports. Even if you are a rich, let's say, region like the EU, you have to export to somewhere. You have to open markets. So all countries basically depend on each other. And we all remember how in the 2016 elections, Americans are still complaining that Russia has intervened in the elections. So basically, interference or interdependence between countries is a matter of fact. It's a matter of life. So basically, all countries have to be ready to depend on others and basically to influence others and be influenced by others. Countries can live in a vacuum or separately. However, if the country, the stronger the country, the more it can influence others and it can be less affected. Mm-hmm. So let's say America is more capable for sure to affect many other nations compared to Somalia or I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Turkey or most of the Middle Eastern countries, because America is a superpower, but others are less powerful. And when we talk about power, we talk about it in comprehensive sense, like political power, economic power, military power, the nature of the regime itself, how open the regime, how strong the regime is. If we move to the Middle East as a region, we are talking that we are our subject today. The Middle East is made of maybe like 24, 25, 26 countries, but they are very different. They are very different at so many levels. And if we talk about military power, for example, we can find a country like Turkey, which is a NATO member. You can find countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They import a lot of weapons every year. They could be, Saudi Arabia could be the third or fourth spender or on the military every year. They have a country like Egypt, which has a strong military, but also they have very small countries. You have countries which are in civil war, total civil war, like Yemen. You don't know who's ruling Yemen. They have a country like Libya, which is divided. When you also talk about regime-wise, you have countries like, let's say, Turkey, which has some kind of a democratic process. Some people say it is moving forward. Some people saying it's facing difficulties, but it has a process working, and it has a regime, and it has a president. You can have a country like Iran, for example, which has a very religious-oriented regime, which is like ruled by a supreme guide. You have countries like Saudi Arabia, which is like sort of a total monarchy. And lots of people even find it difficult to understand what is the nature of the political regime in Saudi Arabia. Who controls it? Yeah, we know the king, but how the king controls the others, it's more difficult. So some countries also are in a total collapse. Economic-wise, you have very rich countries, like the Gulf countries, and then you have Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, which is they depend on international aid. We also have countries like Turkey, which have a very diverse economy. Turkey, for example, has trade, has economic relation, has industry, have agriculture, has tourism, but you have also the Gulf countries, which are oil-oriented and basically very dependent on energy, on the energy sector. You have more diverse economy, let's say, in countries like Egypt, but Egypt has lots of debt. So this kind of diverse and very different Middle East makes you wonder if we can talk about a regional order or several regional orders, and also if you can talk about international influence, like the way how the international community influenced the Middle East. You can talk about several sub-orders in the region. Let's say that the president, like if you talk about the American relationship with the Middle East, you can talk about in general, like the American presence in the Gulf is very different than the American presence in a country like Somalia or Northwest Africa. The Russian influence in like Syria is very different from the Russian influence in the West, North Africa. So we have different Middle Easts. We have several sub-regimes, sub-orders. And the way the international community deals with the Middle East is also different. So if we go back to the international community itself, or the world order, we can say, like everybody understands that America is still the richest, the most militarily powerful country. America until today, the GDP is about $20 trillion. I'm sorry. So basically, its GDP, annual GDP is higher than any other country. China comes second with $14 trillion GDP, annual GDP, which is like about 2/3 of American GDP. You have the EU, which is $18 billion, but the EU is divided. It's made of different countries. You have different foreign policies. You have also who comes first? Russia. Russia, for example, has 1.6 trillion annual GDP. So basically, Russia is basically about 1/10 or less than 1/10. The Russian GDP is less than 1/10 of the American GDP. So when it comes to economic power, America is still the largest economy by far. China comes second, and then you have countries like Germany, Russia, maybe. So basically, what is interesting is, as everybody knows, that how China's GDP has been developing over the last, 10-15 years. That basically, in 2005, the US annual GDP was like, $13 trillion. China was just 2.2. In 2010, the US was $14 trillion, so it increased by $1 trillion between 2005 and 2010. But basically, China doubled during the same period. And so China is rising economically, and lots of studies are wondering when China will have a much bigger economy than the US, which year exactly will it happen, what time. But when it comes to military power, America is still the most, the strongest military power on earth by far. The American annual defense budget is about $700 billion. China last year or this year wants to spend 250, which is a huge increase compared to last year. Russia is only spending $65 billion on its military budget, which is not very far from Saudi Arabia, which spends like $60 billion. But Russia has much developed military industry, I believe, and it's also a nuclear power. When it comes to political leadership, the Americans, the Europeans, they have more experience in international leadership, and maybe the Russians as well. But the Americans, the Europeans, they have this idea of democracy. They have a more comprehensive, let's say, approach to leadership, because they have an ideology as well. Russia has an ideology, China has an ideology, but let's say the West has been working harder to spread its ideology. The ideology for them is more important when it comes to foreign policy. So with the 2009, I think, the international economic crisis, China started to rise more. In 2013, they started the Belt and Road Initiative, and in the 2016, they issued something called the Arab Policy Paper. All of them are important dates. It shows how China is getting more interested in being a global power. Still, it's more of an economic power. It is less of a military power or a political power. America is still the most comprehensive global power so far, because it has all elements. Russia is more of a military power than an economic one. We can also talk about two issues. We can talk about leadership, because economic power is not only about having the assets of power, having military power, economic power, having, it also, you need to have the will to lead. And the problem with America for the last 4 years, they are withdrawing. Like, basically, I think the problem started early, and like 2005 was the problems America was facing in the war in Iraq. We started seeing America withdraw from the Middle East a little bit. They had something called the Democracy Initiative, but then they gave up on spreading democracy in the Middle East. With Obama coming to power, he was interested more in making America less dependent on Middle East oil. in 2015, he signs the Iran agreement, and it was a signal for him that he wants the Middle East countries to balance each other. With Trump, it became much worse because America was not just withdrawing. America became some kind of a headless power. You don't really know what is the American foreign policy. There is lots of conflict in America. There is a vacuum of leadership. So what we have today is more of a competition. It is not a Cold War per se, because you don't have two powers competing each other. We have several powers competing with each other. You have an America that is withdrawing. You have a Russia that is rising, but it's more of a military power, and it's somehow a little bit destructive because look, their intervention in Syria, for example, they now control Syria somehow, but it is a destroyed Syria. So the Russian intervention in Syria couldn't save the country. It saved the regime, but the country has collapsed. So basically, Russia is back in Syria, it's back on the Middle East, but Syria is in ruins. Syria is gone for some time. China is intervening economically. Everybody is saying, it will take time, and gradually it might be more, it might intervene in different ways, politically, in a military level. As they now have a military base in Djibouti. They say we are only interested in economy, but this is what they say, but like power develops. China's strongest relations so far is with like countries which are very, it's like with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Algeria, and Iran. Most of them are pro-American allies, except Iran. After that comes Djibouti, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, and Turkey. So there is some kind of, certain alliance that China is building. They are more interested in the traditional American allies, except for Iran. So it could be a calculated intervention, but we'll see how it will develop over the years. So what is common between all of these powers, and what is common we have spoken about competition between all of them, but like what else? I think we have to look at, to highlight a few points. First, most of the international intervention in the Middle East today is more of interest-based. These countries either interested in Middle East oil, Middle East energy, Middle East markets, maybe stopping Middle East security problems. They don't want immigration, but we don't have ideological or cultural or more comprehensive approach towards the Middle East. The Middle East is seen by a lot of countries as a problematic area. Nobody wants to touch it. They want to deal with it. They want to open markets, sell weapons, buy, trade, but it is seen as an isolated, a distant region, despite the fact it is very central. But it is somehow seen as the other. Europe is not treating the Middle East the way it treated Eastern. Let's say it's not treating the Middle East the way it treated with Eastern Europe. Russia is dealing with it as a backyard. The same China is treating it within the stronger side. So it's still his intervention. Also, it's very individual oriented. So maybe based on convention, there isn't a comprehensive system. So let's say the Americans have a stronger relationship with Gulf countries, but they don't pay lots of attention to, let's say, to Morocco or North Africa or to Somalia. The Gulf is still living really under the American hegemony, American influence, because America has been lots of places in the Gulf because of the flow and because of the oil. Israel also have a very unique relationship with different countries. So really, it's like it's a culture of alliances. We also took as we said, some countries live in different levels of international hegemony. The Gulf still lives under the American superpower. Compared to, let's say, Somalia, which has more of Chinese international intervention. Egypt, which is in the middle, Turkey, which has very unique relationships with European countries, who trade a lot with Turkey and also with Russia, and so you can't. It's like not basically they live under different sub-regional systems basically. Finally, there is also a vacuum. America is withdrawing. The Chinese influence is mainly economic. Russia is intervening, but not all countries. And there is a huge vacuum which is encouraging regional powers to fill it. Especially like we're talking about Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. There is lots of competition and there is lots of wars because there is lots of vacuum and the international community is not really interested in putting more assets into the Middle East. What is lacking, or what could be the future, or what we hope for? I think what is lacking is the idea of a comprehensive order in the Middle East, a comprehensive security system, a comprehensive security and economic system, similar to what exists in the European Union. The Middle East lacks a systematic approach. It lacks a systematic regional order, and it lacks some kind of a systematic relationship with the international community. But such system cannot come from outside only. I think Arabs or Middle Easterns, Turks, Iranians, whoever lives in this region cannot wait for the international community to come and tell them, look, we are tired of dealing with you as different entities which are fighting with each other. Want you to come together, build good relations, improve your political systems, and cooperate and build a united approach. And when it comes to dealing with the world, I think it should come from inside, and it should come from inside every state. And this is a struggle which will take a lot of time. We have seen it was maybe started with something like the Arab Spring, but it failed. It has been defeated by the regime. Lots of the autocratic regimes which exist in the Middle East, it was crushed. But I think the future, a solution that could happen in the future when we have more democratic Middle East, when the countries of the Middle East can basically democratize inside, and then we can build better relationships between each other, relationships built on norms, on values, not just on interests and interests of the regimes. Maybe in the future we can see some kind of a more united Middle East, and hopefully if we have a more united Middle East, it can also start in shaping or being a partner in shaping how the international community deals with the region. However, I understand this is still a distant regime, but this is what I thought could basically be helpful to understand how the international community deals with the Middle East today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bayoumi. Thank you for your remarks. Mr. Bayoumi mentioned the constituent countries of the Middle East in general, and he summarized the general status quo in the Middle East, with China on the rise and the US is on the withdrawal. And he also mentioned the interdependency between countries, and we thank him for all the remarks he's made. Now, I would like to introduce Mr. Chris Doyle, who is the Director of the Council for Arab and British Understanding, and he's joining us from London, I believe. And Mr. Doyle, I am not hearing you.
Hi.
It's good that...
Right. Yep.
Okay, now you're back.
I'm back.
And he's joining us from London, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to you, sir, and please inform us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today to discuss all of this. It's a very important topic, and at a time of acute crises across the Middle East, but also in much of the world. And what we see are many common issues, many common failings, in fact, and much of which has been very well outlined by my colleague tonight, Allah. I'm very grateful to him and everything he said. I think he spoke very clearly about it. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Middle East, we're looking at evolving crises, ones that have now dragged on for a long time, all of which have very deep historical roots as well. A series of increasingly unpredictable actors, not just Middle Eastern, but international. A lack of international consensus and coordination, somewhat in contrast to the past, one could argue. And very much as Allah said, there's no one dominant actor anymore. And there is also no one dominant set of rules. International law is largely seen as useless on the ground. Ask a Palestinian, ask a Syrian, where international law has been violated daily. And one has to question, one talks of the international community, what does one mean by that at this moment? It barely exists. And we've even seen that in the collective failure to really get together to respond to the current COVID-19 pandemic. So what we're looking at is a backdrop of widespread systematic failure of governance, corruption, suppression. It's less a picture of regional order, but regional disorder. So how did we get here? This Cold War in the Middle East, to go to the title, or in comparison to the 20th century version. I think the first thing I'd like to point out is that rivalries in the region are nothing new. One can go back a long time in history, but in more recent times, we've had in the 60s, there was a Saudi-Egyptian rivalry, for example, particularly fought out over Yemen. And very importantly, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which continues, of course, today, that kicked off in 1979, that has had its peaks and troughs. And at one point, you had the Ayatollah Khomeini labeling the Gulf countries as purveyors of American Islam. And of course, you had the Iran-Iraq war, this horrific war, perhaps one of the worst in the 20th century, that lasted from 1980 to 1988. That too sucked in regional powers on both sides. You've also had, for example, the Syrian-Iraqi feud between two rival Ba'ath parties that also lasted until about 2000. You had the isolation of Egypt after the Camp David talks and the peace treaty with Israel, when Egypt, the most populous Arab state, was essentially cut off from much of the Arab world, and the Palestinians felt that they had been stabbed in the back, that they had been betrayed. The Lebanese Civil War was perhaps in some ways a precursor to so much of what we have seen in the last few years in the region, where you saw this complete fragmentation of power, the real and protracted involvement, military involvement of regional powers, including the Israelis, including the Syrians, Palestinians, and others. So that sucked in also the Americans as well. So in some sense, all of this is nothing new. The Iran-Saudi rivalry is decidedly an old Cold War, one that has lasted far too long. So these rivalries have been rampant in the region. But then how do the superpowers play into this? And I think this is really important in terms of one of the key differences. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States became the hegemonic power. So this is a key difference between those rivalries that were played out after the Second World War, in the shadow of that Cold War, where typically regional powers may look to one of the other superpowers for patronage, for arms supplies, etc. But 1990 and the war in 1991 demonstrated that US might, US military and economic power was really pretty much supreme, and particularly during the 1990s. It certainly lasted up until at least the 2003 Iraq War, and arguably up to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Now, that's not to write off the United States, and Allah quite rightly demonstrated its considerable power even today. But it doesn't have that hegemonic ability to dictate events, to really push other powers to do its bidding. It has lost that, and some of that has been given up willingly, in the sense that the last two presidents, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, have not wanted to get too involved in the Middle East. And you remember that it was Obama who wanted to pivot to Asia. The Middle East did not tempt him. It was he who wanted to withdraw Iraqi troops. Donald Trump has, of course, followed in that guise. He's wanted to get out of Afghanistan. He's wanted to get out of Syria. He has not wanted to get involved in any wars. And we've seen at the same time a somewhat resurgent Russia. But I think that has to be seen cautiously. I think it's easy to overplay the Russian role in the region at the moment. It is not the Soviet Union. It doesn't have the same power. In some ways, it is filling a vacuum that the US has actually created. And not just the European Union, it's also Europe. Because all of this, you have to go back to 2003. It was this seismic moment. It further divided the region, but it divided Europe and it hit American power and influence so hard. Britain, where I come from, lost its resolve as well. And both American and British publics, European publics, grew tired of expensive, costly wars abroad. This was amplified by the complete failure of the intervention in Libya in 2011. The only time since then when there has been a really substantive intervention, of course, was against ISIS, the bombing both in Syria and Iraq, principally, a coalition formed for that. But that was a very limited. It was really to avoid boots on the ground. That wasn't desired at all. It was done from an air, and also with not great success, actually. If you really, I think if we look at it in 5 years' time, we'll probably come to that conclusion. But 2003 also saw Iraq smashed. That balance of power between Iran and Iraq was over. And in many ways, the Americans opened the door to the Iranians into Iraq, and they walked right in. Not only the Iranians, but the hardline Islamists, most notably Al-Qaeda in Iraq under the uber-sectarian Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, also did likewise. And it was from Zarqawi's group, it was from that ISIS itself evolved. So we see these major changes. Now, the 2003 war, although it saw the end of the regime and the end of the sanctions and all that, the US-UK occupation didn't usher in some golden age in Iraq, as the neocons promised and dreamed, and it saw really a new means of plundering of Iraq, with an occupation that failed to protect people. It pillaged and laid waste to this oil-rich state's most cherished resources and heritage. And this further undermined US reputation, British reputation within the region. And I think that has also put a brake on our ability to influence matters in the Middle East. So the political challenges of 2020 are in many ways rooted in that tumultuous and incompetent US rule, particularly the time under the overlordship of Ambassador Paul Bremer. And all the farcical constitution process, the reliance on discredited exile groups, a mistake repeated both in Libya and to an extent in Syria as well. And the embedding and formalization of a sectarian, identity-based political system that still haunts Iraq today, but that way of thinking also haunts the Western approach towards Syria and other countries. Moving on, what we have now in the Middle East today is multiple actors, state and non-state, unleashed on the region in no small way by this inertia and lack of leadership from the US, which has reached its lowest point with the Trump administration's America First isolationism and this undermining of the rules-based international order. This includes the trashing of the Iran nuclear deal, which was at least an attempt to bring an end to that file. It has its flaws, but it was certainly very important, and hopefully to calm relations with Iran. It was an opportunity, but that has now been ransacked, torn up. The European Union, far from getting involved, is more engaged in navel gazing. It's concerned with its own internal challenges, including Brexit, but others as well, immigration, their financial challenges, not least after the pandemic. And they're more focused on putting up barriers rather than resolving conflicts. So all of this has left the regional powers with the greatest opportunity for decades to assert their power and influence, free from the shackles of the US or powerful Soviet Union or even a European Union attempting to influence it. So powers like Iran and Turkey and Israel, principally because non-Arab states have appeared the most potent, the best place to try to assert their power. But also you have Saudi, the UAE, Qatar as well, who have used their petrodollars to influence matters and increasingly been more assertive, particularly since 2010. And the non-state actors. We mentioned the more extreme of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, but other non-state actors as well, the Muslim Brotherhood. But I would emphasize that the key Arab actors are extremely weak, and that's been one of the features of what has happened in history. You would look to Iraq as a strong Arab actor, that's no longer there. Egypt has suffered in recent years with all its revolutions and changes of government and economic challenges that it faces. So it's Israel, Iran, and Turkey that are leading the regional charge. There is also another very powerful actor, the powerful protest movements that have brought certain countries to their knees, loosely formed movements, yes, but it still shows in what we saw last year and even this year that those protests of the Arab Spring of 2010 and 11, they've never been killed off by the reactionary powers who don't want to see democracy in the region. Look at the protests last year in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, and you see amongst so many peoples in the region this desire for fundamental root and branch change, challenge to the existing elite power systems, that they want to see the end of corrupt regimes, even more concerned about the environmental damage that has been happening. You've seen that in Lebanon. Now, I'm going to briefly also refer to some of the Islamist groups. They are not dead, as I said. There is now a report that shows that ISIS has conducted 566 attacks in the first 3 months of the year. It's tapping into, as it always tries to, as Al-Qaeda does, as other groups do, that really huge whirlpool of anger and frustration. It will attempt to make use of the sectarian, ethnic, and other identity cleavages that have opened up in the region. It plays on that, and very well. And the Muslim Brotherhood is also still a major political actor. It won a presidential election in Egypt. Yet, regional fault lines open up on this issue. We see that the United Arab Emirates perhaps leads the charge, extremely keen to prevent any Muslim Brotherhood government coming into being, whether elected or not. Is that realistic or desirable? Was it sensible to have situations where Muslim Brotherhood groups won elections but were not allowed to govern, whether in Algeria, Palestine, Egypt? Was it counterproductive? And that is not to say that the Muslim Brotherhood had answers to the region, whether the economy of the region or the social issues, the huge levels of unemployment, youth unemployment. But it is a group that represents viewpoints within the region. And I think that one has to have inclusive solutions. One has to have dialogues with people that perhaps some won't agree with. And to address some of these and to pose the questions to such groups about such issues as the role of women. And none of this is aided by the long-running conflicts in Palestine, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. And Israel-Palestine is one where the failure of the international community is long-running, the trashing of international law, which we could see in even sharper focus if an annexation goes forward from the 1st of July. But it's Syria, Yemen, and Libya, and I think they provide us with the face of future wars. Fractured power, failing states, chronic corruption and inequality, wars based in part on identity groups backed by regional powers. They'll be using, drones. We've seen this a lot in Libya. So it's war by arm's length, using mercenaries. So the Russians used the Wagner group. They brought in Sudanese fighters. They brought in Syrian. So the GNA is also brought in with Turkish help Syrian fighters as well. So the use of mercenaries is on the rise. And as for Libya, was there a country that hasn't got involved, that hasn't bombed it? And today it's divided amongst numerous armed powers and backing, etc. The Syrian, the government, the regime, Russia, the US, Turkey, Kurds, various Islamist groups. What do we call it now? Just a crisis? Was it a civil war? But it's also a political conflict, a proxy war, both regional and international, and a war between rival radical jihadi groups and other opposition groups as well, all coming under the brutalization of an entire people by the regime. And that also led to a Lebanese crisis and a crisis for Turkey and Jordan, the refugees, and the crisis in Iraq as well. It helped to fuel that. So it all shows that a crisis in one country like Syria, it spills over the borders, it's not contained. It would be ridiculous to presume that Yemen is going to be contained purely to Yemen, or Libya just to Libya. But one thing that does give hope is the extraordinary courage, particularly of ordinary Syrians working for their communities, keeping services running, and trying to build a future in the face of this horror. And it's particularly acute right now. The price of bread has doubled in the last couple of weeks. We are looking at the Syrian pound is 60 times lower than it was before 2011, and 80% of the population in poverty. This is going to be a story that is going to run and run. I don't see an immediate end to the Syrian issue right now, nor any power that's going to come in and help to rebuild this country. What will the future hold then? It's very tough to determine. So much is up in the air, and not just the virus, and what will that lead to? I think much will depend in the international arena, of course, on who wins the election on the 3rd of November. It's not looking great for Donald Trump right at the moment, but a few months ago he was looking a solid favourite. Can the EU resolve some of those issues and reacquire some leadership to reinforce the sense of an international rules-based order? That's also unlikely. Can Saudi Arabia, both racked by huge economic challenges, be persuaded that they need to rub along with each other as neighbours and not to fight this Cold War in other countries like in Yemen? And can we construct a climate of reconciliation and peace building that's truly inclusive? It includes all parties, notably greater inclusion for women, better treatment for minority communities across the region. It's looking bleak at the moment, but so many things can change. We've seen extraordinary change within the region, and hopefully we can rebuild a system within the region where we will get towards a more democratic, inclusive government, a rules-based order, and that it's not rivalries, but people look to how they can cooperate and collaborate with each other to build a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle, for enriching our webinar. Now that you have both finished making your remarks, I'd like to ask a few questions. For instance, Mr. Ala Bayumi, you suggested that we are in need of a similar, that is comprehensive in terms of being economic and political. Do you suggest a Middle Eastern Union that is similar to that of the EU, or can you elaborate more on that, please?
Yeah, I don't think you can create systems from above. I don't think, when the Europeans didn't create the EU in the 60s or the 70s, when they started, or 50s, when they started to work on the European, or the idea of coming together and working on a shared system. I think what you need to start like gradually, and at least to reform inside every country, and to build relations between neighbors. Like, Egypt has now it has a deep crisis with Sudan and Ethiopia over the River Nile. So Egypt, which has been using the River Nile for like 6,000 years, doesn't have a system of dealing with its own neighbors. They are always asking, talking about agreements which they have signed under the British colonization, and then Ethiopia says oh, we didn't even exist at that time. We you signed it with the British. We are not part of it. So what do you want? Why do you want us to obey such agreement? And for maybe for decades, Egypt have never went back to the Nile countries and told them, look, let's come together and see how we can benefit from the Nile and how we can save our share. So there's lots of work can be done between even neighbors before you can think about like, a regional order. Like the GCC now is extremely disunited. All of them, even they are rich countries, they have very similar economic conditions, tribal relationships, the similar political regimes, but like, they are extremely disunited. There is a blockade of Qatar has been going on for 3 years right now. Qatar has to count on American and Turkish support to face off the pressure from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Similar challenges exist between like, North African countries. So I think the idea of coming first with a system and telling people, look, we want you to implement this is not the right approach. The right approach is basically to work internally and then with your neighbors and let it grow. But also one aspect which is very important is cultural and education and like, the societal aspect. I think one serious problem that we, as an Egyptian, I think Egypt faced after the 2011 revolution or uprising against Mubarak is how general people like really quickly gave up on the idea of democracy. Because like the military was expected to crack down on the protesters, to try to divide them, and to convince people that to stay away from democracy, that will bring chaos. But I think the military had a much easy way because the people were not really educated about democracy. They were not really educated about democratic transition. Even let's say the journalists, the media, the intellectual elite, the idea of democratic transition has never been clear in Egypt in 2011, 2012, and 2013, and even today. People want a revolution, but they don't know exactly what they want after a revolution or what does a revolution means. I think in the Middle East, because of the long decades of oppression and of dictatorships and autocratic rule, the educational institutions has been weakened, the societies have been weakened, and that brings a serious challenge because you have lots of masses who are used to brainwashing, who are used to information wars, and it's not easy to bring them together around one idea, especially if this idea is complicated like democracy and democratic transition. And the more dictatorships rule the region, the more the weakened and divided are the people, and the more weakened and divided, or the more weakened are the educational institutions, which really poses a challenge of how to bring enough educational awareness and infrastructure and cultural infrastructure to support any political change. So it adds to the challenge really. The change has to come on site, but also it has like a cultural educational aspect, which is not easy to spread in under current regimes in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mr. Doyle, seeing that yourself is the director of the Council for Arab and British Understanding, now that you mentioned that Iran, Turkey, and Israel are today more prominent than they were before in the history of the Middle Eastern Cold War, such as the 60s. Now, why do you think that the non-Arab countries have risen to prominence whilst Arab countries are diminishing? Again, we do not hear you.
It's a new system, I'm not used to it.
Okay.
It's a very good question. I think in part it's some of the internal strengths of some of those countries. We have seen, I think Israel has its own strengths. That's not to say that I agree with what it's done in terms of the occupied territory, but it has, developed an entrepreneurial economy. It's a first-class, first world economic military power. You can't ignore that. It's arguably less dependent on the United States than it might once have been. It could stand on its own 2 feet. It could actually divorce itself from the United States right now and still survive, I think, as a powerful actor within the Middle East. Turkey has grown and become a regional powerhouse as well economically. You know this better than I do. I would hesitate to comment on that, but we've seen this. And Iran has always been a major power, but I think that it has also, filled the gap that's been overtaken, the opportunities in front of it. There's a greater sense that there is a direction and purpose to what it's doing. I think that in many ways, the Gulf states have not taken up some of those opportunities. I think that Saudi Arabia has wasted chances, wasted a lot of money on projects that perhaps it was wisest not to do. It has taken too long to open up. I think that it was held back by the image of it as being a feudal, country, etc. It's only recently that they've allowed women to drive, so I think they're hesitant to take forward the sorts of reforms that are necessary. And I think the various rivalries between Arab states haven't helped. There's a bit of a myth about Arab togetherness and solidarity, but actually it's not really been there. Look at the way Saudi Arabia had hardly any dealings with the post-Saddam Iraq. Look at what's been going on in Lebanon. So you see the rivalries and the tensions. Even on occasions, Saudi and the UAE right now are meant to be, in some close ties, but they're running completely different policies within Yemen, which is also not helping the situation. So, there are these divisions, and of course, external powers on occasions have attempted to exacerbate those divisions on a divide and rule policy. But there's, take any 2 Arab states at the moment, and you'll probably find some significant divisions, and you see this replicated time and time again at the Arab League and in summits. So in a sense, they pay lip service to Arab solidarity and Arab collective will, but it doesn't really exist. By the way, you might say that often about the European Union as well. We've seen this fracturing of power and different viewpoints. And Ala mentioned that the Qatari dispute, that shows even that the GCC is really bust as an entity right now. And that was perhaps one, regional coordinating body that was to an extent working. There was something going on there that actually was bringing them together in terms of transport and, trade and so forth, and common economic policies. So, it's very unfortunate. I think that there is also cultural and economic reasons. I don't think they've invested enough in education within the Arab world. I think that's, which Allah was talking about. I think that's, really held them back. But, with sensible governance and investment for the long term of this, it can be addressed. But you have to unleash the power and the talents of the people in the region. And I don't see that happening. And it has happened more in, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. I think you get a sense there that their peoples have greater opportunities to shine. Imperfectly. I'm not going to say that all of these countries are perfect either, but in comparison.
Thank you, sir. These days, some analysts and pundits would say that there is actually a new power dynamic going on in the Middle East. They portray that Turkey and Qatar on one end, and then Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain and Egypt on another end. Do you, both of you, think that it is correct to present these 2 camps as if they are in a dichotomy with each other?
Who wants to go first?
Chris, go ahead.
Okay, well, there is a sense that this exists, but there is this sort of the quartet that was created to deal with Qatar in particular that sort of showed it, and then the way in which Turkish forces, claimed Qatar as well, claimed Qatar as well, etc. This seemed to highlight it. But then again, you scratch a little bit under the surface. There are differences, on Syria amongst these groups. it wasn't that long ago that Saudi and Qatar were very much aligned with Syrian opposition. They may have been backing rival groups, etc., but they were both against the Assad regime. So there's all these things that doesn't necessarily, make it a perfect sort of picture. You can't explain everything by this. You will find that they're going to be, Saudi Arabia is less hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood than the Emirates, for example. So they have their own tensions as well. It'll be interesting to see how they have their own priorities, each of them. And it's a great pity, I think, that the whole Qatar issue came out. I think it's been completely self-defeating for all concerned. It's unnecessary in a region that is wrecked with conflicts to have yet another one. And I think it would have been better to try to work out their differences in a more diplomatic framework. There are differences, there are grievances, but I don't think you can see everything, in these lines. And I think, for example, Egypt has somewhat backed off from the whole Qatar dispute. Egypt also has a different view on Syria, so they don't agree on everything, but sometimes they coalesce on one issue,
Thank you.
Yeah, I sort of agree with Chris. Yeah, it's not like a clear cut. It's like, the camps, no internal divisions. But I want to start with first, let's say there are three camps, not two, because you have like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and UAE is one camp, and then you have Qatar, Turkey, which has close relationships, and then you have the Iranian camp, which is like Iran, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad, and like I think some groups in Iraq or maybe Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, and so basically it's like becoming three camps. You can see like how basically you can see some clear lining of between the three camps and how they really Iran is leading basically a Shia alliance, and I personally think Iran is much weaker than it looks like, considering the nature of its political regime. It's an ideological regime. It's a closed regime. It's, let's say they have a tough regime. Yeah, it might be working, but I don't know for how long. It's like losing a revolutionary regime that is very ideological, that has an idea, that has a religious background, that has lots of military institutions, a very complex system of military institutions supporting the regime. But I don't know how much it is supported by the people. We have seen like economic protests in Iran, and like in the last every few years, basically every 2 years, we have a major protest in Iran that is cracked down by the regime itself. I don't know how free people are. I don't know if people really support the regime or they are forced to live under the regime. And we are talking about the political regime, like maybe not like maybe some of the orientations of the regime could be supported by the Iranian people. Maybe the Iranian people want to be a regional power. They see themselves differently from other countries, but I don't know if it is the same way the Iranian regime wants to them to behave. And I personally feel that the Iranian regime, despite the fact that it has been gaining success in Iraq, in Syria, I don't know if in Lebanon and Yemen, but I think it has been losing in general in the Middle East because before the Arab Spring, lots of groups, like let's say religious groups, the religious camp, even like countries like Qatar or Turkey was also closer to Iran before the Arab Spring. But now Iran is seen as some kind of, a de facto power that everyone has deal with it, but in because they have to deal with it. Like it's like, I think it's becoming, it's losing popularity, it's losing public support at least. So this is Iranian camp, and then you have the ideological war or the ideological camp between Turkey and Qatar on the same side versus Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and and United Arab Emirates on the other side. It's basically the main difference between them is not economic. I think actually they could benefit much more if they cooperate with each other. It's not an economic challenge. It's not a military challenge. It's really basically, I think America has been pushing the Gulf countries to work together to build a military alliance. Because basically, if the Patriot missiles in Saudi Arabia, it's much easier to defend Qatar and like really, America wants them to work together against Iran, for example. But it's more of an ideological difference. It's like basically division about the Arab Spring, about if the support, if they have to support, who should or shouldn't support change in the Middle East. And I personally think the nature of this difference is really important because it shows how the Middle East, as Chris was saying, the Middle Eastern countries cannot really work with each other because the nature of the regimes themselves. If you have a regime that doesn't trust its own people, that doesn't trust change, that doesn't trust its own institutions, how do you expect it to work with anyone else? Like if the Egyptian regime, for example, like, when President Sisi came, it has to dismantle the general intelligence because the general intelligence supported the Mubarak regime, and they had to remove the head of the intelligence several times and put his right-hand man, Abbas Kamel, to be the head of the general intelligence to make sure the general intelligence support him and doesn't spy on him. And he would never allow free elections. The same thing, I think, Saudi Arabia, you can see how the power struggles. They have to remove Mohammed bin Nayef, put him under house arrest. So if the regimes themselves don't trust each other, I don't think they trust anyone else. I think it's zero-sum game, unfortunately played by most of these dictatorship regimes. And I don't think it will end easily. I'm pessimistic. Unfortunately, I think it will end in a very bad way. What we have seen in the Middle East for the last 10 years is countries pushing themselves toward collapse. We haven't seen any country democratize except maybe Tunisia. I don't know if Algeria or Sudan will succeed. I don't know what the future is waiting for Egypt. If the Egyptian government doesn't open up for its own people, it's going to face now the economic crisis because of coronavirus. It has a health crisis. It has a water crisis with Ethiopia. It has a security crisis in Sinai and Libya. All of these pressures. Are we going to see a much weakened state in Egypt and other places in the Middle East? What's the future of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates? Lots of countries, if they don't really build institutions, if they don't open up for their own people, I'm worried that we'll have internal weakness and regional weakness as well.
Very true. I would actually personally question, seeing that you've mentioned institutionalism and how important it is, that I am not entirely sure whether Saudi Arabia and the UAE could be considered states in the sense that Turkey, Iran, or France or the UK are states. I don't personally see a state culture in those countries. I merely see dynasties ruling with an iron fist. And some would say that the MBZ of the United Arab Emirates is actually behind all of this. Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah. The definition of a state itself is per se is very simple. A state is a land, people, and government. However, what do you call it? A state of an institution? It's not a state of an institution. It is not a state of institutions. You don't really. Yeah, I totally agree. And unfortunately, this is the scenario we have seen in most of the Arab countries. Like in America now, we see how Trump is behaving badly. But no one has a doubt that 10 years from now, America will exist. America will exist in the next 6 months. It will exist in the next 4 years. It will exist in the next 10 years. God protects him from Trump and what he's doing. But nobody has a doubt. But the problem with Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Saddam Hussein ruled with an iron fist. Gaddafi ruled with an iron fist. But after Gaddafi leaves, the country collapsed. Saudi Arabia is a rich country. It has lots of economic power, has lots of strong, it's like a well-armed military. But
not a well military.
How stable its political regime or its state institutions, it's a big question. I don't know if Chris has more information than myself. The United Arab Emirates, it has a working economic model. How united the country is. It's interesting that there was a number of opposition figures, Saudi opposition figures that I spoke to recently, or I heard them discussing with each other in a conference, very rare conference, a small one, and they were talking about something that amazed me. I always look at the Egyptian opposition as very weak. because you have divided the religious groups against the secular groups, and the Muslim Brotherhood and the liberals and the Nasir, the supporters of Nasir's. But the Saudi opposition figures were telling each other, look, we don't have a national identity. What is our national identity? What makes us Saudis? 70 years ago, we're Najd, Hijaz, Medina, Mecca, and we are tribal based. Do we really have a national? So it amazes me. First, they are very small groups, very disunited, like individuals. In Egypt, we have groups and a culture of political opposition and parties and state. And but I'm amazed. They are wondering what is the national identity. So it made me worry. I wish the best to all Arab countries. We want stability. I don't think going through the issue of regime change and collapse and stability is good for anyone. But it requires work. Nothing is granted. If the British didn't have revolutions, didn't work for challenge the queen, the king, and build their own institutions, you never had the state they have right now. If the Americans didn't fight civil wars, or they never had the state they have right now. So building institutions is necessary, but it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything that Alaz has said. There's a few extra comments, really. I mean, that essentially these are all new states we're talking about. There's some with great historical backdrops. Iran was Persia, Egypt, we mentioned Turkey, but there's so many new states in this region that are struggling with their identity. Kuwait, Jordan, these are modern concepts. We know because Britain drew the lines. We created them. So of course, sitting here in Europe, I mustn't take a sort of privileged position. We've taken hundreds of years to build up our institutions, our democratic practices, and we still have to fight for them, day in, day out. And look at the assault on the democratic system in the United States that Donald Trump has taken against the media, against the law courts, against anybody who really disagrees with them. So it is always a permanent process of working on this. So yes, the region definitely, and it's not just the Gulf states, it's not just Saudi, nearly all of them have these challenges. And of course, in those oil-rich Gulf states, it's a different issue, is that because all the income comes in at the top and is then given out as largesse to the people, that gives them an additional form of control, a compliant population, because they depend upon that state. So yes, you can say there isn't much of a state, but actually I remember being in Kuwait some years ago, and I woke up, read the papers, and it said that the Emir of Kuwait was paying off all Kuwaiti debts. That is, all debts of a Kuwaiti citizens. Yeah, if you have a mortgage, if etc. And I was, I could see a few disappointed Kuwaitis who hadn't taken out a big loan. But that sort of sense, these oil, hydrocarbon-rich states, that the state provides everything for you, is also holding them back. That it'll be the state who looks after to do that. Should they pay for water? No. Should they pay for So there's no that actually, it encourages a somewhat lazy attitude, from the cradle to the grave attitude, where you see actually countries that don't have that. And Ala mentioned Tunisia. The sense that have really got to work for it. And those oil-rich economies have failed and failed. How many plans have we seen that say we must diversify the economy, must get more Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris into the workforce? It's still, they're finding that a challenge. It's not really happening. But that they are going to have to face this. This is the big challenge going forward for all of them. Going forward, and it won't be helped with if we have pandemics and the oil price crashing to levels where it's almost cheaper than water. We are going to see some countries with some serious budget deficits in the next year or two. I don't know how they're going to handle all of it. We're seeing an economic crisis in Syria and Lebanon, but that's going to be seen elsewhere. Big shrinking of the economies. What impact is that going to have? Is that going to bring a lot of people out of the streets once again? Because one thing is guaranteed, really, isn't it? Price of bread goes up too much. That really hits everyone.
Yeah. So I believe we do not have questions from the attendees, and if you don't have any more remarks to make, I would like to give the webinar a conclusion and finish for today.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to chat, and it's a pleasure to see Allah and hear his thoughts as well. Thank you for hosting us.
Okay.
Thank you.
My
Farah.
pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. It was really great listening to all your very useful comments and informative information. It was really appreciated. Thanks for the center course.
Thank you. Thank you both
very
for
much.
really illuminative remarks and informative comments on Middle Eastern affairs and the Middle Eastern Cold War that we are experiencing today. And so I wish you a good night and hope we will see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you.